Hello, everyone. Oh, very good. I thought I would like to share with you a few thoughts about these wonderful Schumann symphonies. And I apologize to those connoisseurs, 200 of you, who have come to both concerts. And I congratulate you. If I seem to be repeating myself, it's because I am. I simply adore these four symphonies of Robert Schumann. I think they're quite wonderful, quite unique. They're unlike any other symphonies in the 19th century. They, of course, come from the very center of the century. He wrote them between 1841 and 1850. And they are so beautiful, they are so tuneful. They sing. The orchestra makes the most wonderful sounds, very interesting harmonies, and they're all very original. He was extremely original. For somebody who hadn't written orchestral music before, even more so. So they are at the heart of the early-ish Romantic movement, before it became rather grand, with Brahms and with Wagner and so on, and which actually made it difficult for his music later on. So putting it in context, in the classical period with Haydn and Mozart, music was pretty well behaved, to a certain extent formulaic, quite wonderful in its own way. Then came that fellow Beethoven, who turned the 18th century on its head, but still was an 18th century composer, full of drama, full of intellect, full of look at me. All the German composers who came after Beethoven turned away from Beethoven. They didn't think it could be repeated, and they were quite glad he was out of the way, really. Schubert carried one of his coffin carriers, but Schubert never wrote anything remotely like Beethoven. And he waited till Beethoven had died before he really pushed his last great symphony, the C major symphony. That piece showed that you could write a great symphony and a big, long symphony without being like Beethoven. You could tell stories. You didn't have to argue. The development sections weren't arguing. They were simply developing quietly on their own way. Great music of a completely different way. So music could become tuneful, could tell stories. Schumann personally picked that up. He went to Vienna 10 years after Schubert's death in 1838 and talked to Schubert's brother, and Schubert's brother said, well, there is a symphony you could look at. It's a great C major, never really been played. And Schumann brought it back copied it back to Leipzig and showed it to his friend Mendelssohn, who played it in Leipzig in 1839. Right on cue, because Schumann starts writing symphonies in 1841. So that was the kind of symphony that they wanted to write. Mendelssohn wrote the Italian symphony, the Scottish symphony, the Reformation symphony, and Schumann wrote the Spring Symphony, which we heard last night, and he wrote the Rhenish Symphony, which we're going to hear tonight. And both the other two, although they don't have nicknames, they are in fact very programmatic. The one we heard last night was about Robert and about Bach, extraordinary piece. And number 4, which was really number 2, because number 2 was really number 3, or something. In number 4 he wrote also in 1841, the same year as the First Symphony. It didn't go down very well, so he put it away, edited it, and it came out in 1851, just after number 3 actually. So it is his second symphony. So that symphony is in fact, moving on to the piece we're just about to play, is in fact a Clara symphony. And we know that because Schumann was very interested in ciphers, in musical word plays, and he made out the opening theme of this symphony was C blank C blank A. So that was, as far as he was concerned, that was Clara. And he wrote the symphony 1 year after they got married in 1840, and he wanted to celebrate his marriage with this symphony. He dedicated it entirely to Clara. And every movement has that sort of shape, or the inversion, or slowed down. It's a hymn of praise to his new wife, his happy state. Their first child was on the way, and he suddenly was writing symphonies, 2.5 symphonies in his first year, having in the previous year written 148 songs. Before that, innumerable piano pieces. He was, of course, manic depressive. He had a very difficult life. But thank goodness he wrote the most wonderful music. When I was young, they hardly played the Schumann symphonies. They had been, as it were, drowned out by Wagner and by Brahms. And there was also the problem that they tried to play them with very big orchestras, and they don't sound so good as they do here. You can play them with big orchestras, but you have to double the woodwind as well if you want to double the strings. This is the size that Schumann had in mind. This was the size of Mendelssohn's orchestra in Leipzig, and most good-sized orchestras in other towns, London, Berlin. And so here you have the right size. We spend a lot of time trying to play the music the way the composer would have expected. So the size is one very important thing. The seating you're probably used to, but it's taken me quite a long time to get all the orchestras in the world to change over. First violins and second violins, that was standard all through the 19th century, in the first half of the 20th. The horns one side, the trumpets the other side, so there are dialogues which you hear often in these pieces. So size, seating, sound, of course, we play without that funny wobbly stuff. I think they call it vibrato. But only some of the instruments play it anyway. Clarinets don't use it, the horns don't use it. In Germany, none of the brass players use it. The piano doesn't use it. So let's not do it. We don't do it, so you're hearing more or less what was going on there. We also try to play with the sort of bow stroke and playing style that we can learn from David. David was a Mendelssohn's concert master, first violin, and in fact he conducted the first performance of the Fourth Symphony in 1841. So we try to play the way that they played in those days. One thing that an audience then would have found very surprising if they'd been sitting with you would have been the strange silence between the movements, because of course they clapped every movement of a symphony or a string quartet. Last night's audience were very, very good. They did well. They clapped when it was a good idea, and then somehow when it was a quiet ending, they didn't. That's exactly what would have happened in those days. But please feel free to applaud plenty in the Rhenish Symphony. But this one of his experiments is to have the movements going from one to the next. So he didn't expect applause. Mendelssohn did the same in the Scottish Symphony. He said, please play the movement without the usual gap in between for applause. So you can be very, very historical by not applauding this symphony, but applauding like mad after the interval, if you want to. If you don't, we'll probably just stop and walk off the stage. Anyway, here is the Fourth Symphony. It's very, very beautiful. I've told you about some of the material in it. The movements are the normal ones. It speaks for itself. It's very, very beautiful. And I hope you enjoy it as much as we will.